Globalization is the process of international integration arising from the interchange of worldviews, products, ideas and mutual sharing, and other aspects of culture. Advances in transportation, such as the steam locomotive, steamship, jet engine, container ships, and in telecommunications infrastructure, including the rise of the telegraph and its modern offspring, the Internet, and mobile phones, have been major factors in globalization, generating further interdependence of economic and cultural activities. Though scholars place the origins of globalization in modern times, others trace its history long before the European Age of Discovery and voyages to the New World. Some even trace the origins to the 3rd millennium BCE. Large-scale globalization began in the 19th century. In the late 19th century and early 20th century, the connectivity of the world's economies and cultures grew very quickly. The concept of globalization is a very recent term, only establishing its current meaning in the 1970s, which emerged from the intersection of 4 interrelated sets of communities of practice: academics, journalists, publishers, editors, and librarians. In 2000, the International Monetary Fund identified 4 basic aspects of globalization: trade and transactions, capital and investment movements, migration and movement of people, and the dissemination of knowledge. Further, environmental challenges such as global warming, cross-boundary water and air pollution, and overfishing of the ocean are linked with globalization. Globalizing processes affect and are affected by business and work organization, economics, socio-cultural resources, and the natural environment. Overview: humans have interacted over long distances for thousands of years. The overland Silk Road that connected Asia, Africa, and Europe is a good example of the transformative power of translocal exchange that existed in the Old World. Philosophy, religion, language, the arts, and other aspects of culture spread and mixed as nations exchanged products and ideas. In both the 15th and 16th centuries, Europeans made important discoveries in their exploration of the oceans, including the start of transatlantic travel to the New World of the Americas. Global movement of people, goods, and ideas expanded significantly in the following centuries. Early on in the 19th century, the development of new forms of transportation and telecommunications that compressed time and space allowed for increasingly rapid rates of global interchange. In the 20th century, road vehicles, intermodal transport, and airlines made transportation even faster. The advent of electronic communications, most notably mobile phones and the Internet, connected billions of people in new ways by the year 2010. Etymology and usage: the term globalization has been defined in many different ways since it was first used in a scholarly fashion in 1967, when the term was used to explain the fundamental processes which had taken place in the world's scope. These fundamental processes included a wide variety of economy, socio-political, moral, and ideological interactions taking place between different cultures. Scholars have often considered the West as the leader of this development, since the growth of U.S. power after the Second World War. Many scholars define globalization, based mainly on economics. Fu and Chu explain globalization involves the spread of the global economy to regional economies around the world and requires integration of local economies into the global market. These authors claim that as a result of these growing ties, social life has been reorganized on a global scale. Iwabuchi links globalization to the growth of cross-border interaction that took place during the last few decades after the Cold War, during which time the mobility of capital, people, and commodity has been further intensified by the penetration of neoliberalism, marketization, and the amplification of international ethno-flows of labor, immigrants and tourists. The term globalization is derived from the word globalize, which refers to the emergence of an international network of economic systems, One of the earliest known usages of the term as a noun was in a 1930 publication entitled Towards New Education, where it denoted a holistic view of human experience in education. A related term, corporate giants, was coined by Charles Taze Russell in 1897 to refer to the largely national trusts and other large enterprises of the time. By the 1960s, both terms began to be used as synonyms by economists and other social scientists. Economist Theodore Levitt is widely credited with coining the term in an article entitled Globalization of Markets, which appeared in the May-June 1983 issue of Harvard Business Review. However, the term globalization was in use well before and had been used by other scholars as early as 1981. Levitt can be credited with popularizing the term and bringing it into the mainstream business audience in the later half of the 1980s. Since its inception, the concept of globalization has inspired competing definitions and interpretations, with antecedents dating back to the great movements of trade and empire across Asia and the Indian Ocean from the 15th century onwards. Due to the complexity of the concept, research projects, articles, and discussions often remain focused on a single aspect of globalization. Roland Robertson, professor of sociology at University of Aberdeen, an early writer in the field, defined globalization in 1992 as the compression of the world and the intensification of the consciousness of the world as a whole. Sociologists Martin Albrow and Elizabeth King define globalization as all those processes by which the peoples of the world are incorporated into a single world society. Lechner and Bowley define it as more people across large distances becoming connected in more and different ways. In The Consequences of Modernity, Anthony Giddens uses the following definition. Globalization can thus be defined as the intensification of worldwide social relations which link distant localities in such a way that local happenings are shaped by events occurring many miles away and vice versa. In Global Transformations, David Held, al. study the definition of globalization. Although in its simplistic sense globalization refers to the widening, deepening and speeding up of global interconnection, such a definition begs further elaboration. Globalization can be located on a continuum with the local, national and regional. At one end of the continuum lie social and economic relations and networks which are organized on a local or national basis. At the other end lie social and economic relations and networks which crystallize on the wider scale of regional and global interactions. Globalization can refer to those spatial-temporal processes of change which underpin a transformation in the organization of human affairs by linking together and expanding human activity across regions and continents. Without reference to such expansive spatial connections, there can be no clear or coherent formulation of this term. A satisfactory definition of globalization must capture each of these elements: extensity, intensity, velocity and impact. Held al.'s definition of globalization as transformation in the spatial organization of social relations and transactions, described in terms of the four elements, was called probably the most widely cited definition in the 2014 DHL Global Connectiveness Index. Swedish journalist Thomas Larsson, in his book The Race to the Top, The Real Story of Globalization, states that globalization is the process of world shrinkage, of distances getting shorter, things moving closer. It pertains to the increasing ease with which somebody on one side of the world can interact, to mutual benefit, with somebody on the other side of the world. Responding to the many problems with existing definitions of globalization, including the tendencies to give the impression that spatial distance is being overcome, the world is getting smaller, or globalization has always been the same kind of process across human history. Paul James defines globalization with a more direct and historically contextualized emphasis. Globalization is the extension of social relations across world space. defining that world space in terms of the historically variable ways that it has been practiced and socially understood through changing world time. The journalist Thomas L. Friedman popularized the term flat world, arguing that globalized trade, outsourcing, supply chaining, and political forces had permanently changed the world, for better and worse. He asserted that the pace of globalization was quickening and that its impact on business organization and practice would continue to grow. Economist Takis Fotopoulos defined economic globalization as the opening and deregulation of commodity, capital and labor markets that led toward present neoliberal globalization. He used political globalization to refer to the emergence of a transnational elite and a phasing out of the nation-state. Cultural globalization, he used to reference the worldwide homogenization of culture. Other of his usages included ideological globalization, technological globalization, and social globalization. Manfred Steger, professor of global studies and research leader in the Global Cities Institute at RMIT University, identifies four main empirical dimensions of globalization: economic, political, cultural, and ecological, with a fifth dimension, the ideological, cutting across the other four. The ideological dimension, according to Steger, is filled with a range of norms, claims, beliefs, and narratives about the phenomenon itself. Paul James asserts that the concept of globalization emerged from the intersection of four interrelated sets of communities of practice: academics, journalists, publishers, editors, and librarians. He notes the term was used in education to describe the global life of the mind, in international relations to describe the extension of the European common market, and in journalism to describe how the American Negro and his problem are taking on a global significance. According to James, the oldest dominant form of globalization is embodied globalization, the movement of people. A second form is agency-extended globalization, the circulation of agents of different institutions, organizations, and polities, including imperial agents. Object-extended globalization, a third form, is the movement of commodities and other objects of exchange. The transmission of ideas, images, knowledge and information across world space he calls disembodied globalization, maintaining that it is currently the dominant form of globalization. James holds that this series of distinctions allows for an understanding of how, today, the most embodied forms of globalization, such as the movement of refugees and migrants, are increasingly restricted, while the most disembodied forms, such as the circulation of financial instruments and codes, are the most deregulated. Globophobia has been used incorrectly to refer to the fear of globalization.